So today we're going to talk about creating different kinds of texture. We're going to be working on textures for brick and stone for this next project. So that's what we're going to start with. I'm going to start by showing you how to do a wet blend or a scumble, which is one technique that you can use to get a lot of color on and get some base texture going and getting some movement created. And then we'll move into some other a little more defined textures after that. So I'm going to adjust the camera so that you can see what I'm doing, and then we will get started. Okay, so for this project, we're going to have two different kinds of things. We have kind of a flagstone, fieldstone, limestone kind of texture, and then we have our brick texture. So we'll start off with the base for the stone, which is going to be these kind of cream colors. We have a kind of light cream color. We have a slightly more mid-tone color, and you could do a wet blend or a scumble with as many colors as you want, really. I generally find that, between 2 and 4 is about what you can manage realistically, and anything more than that just tends to get muddy unless you're doing a really big area. So start with a couple of colors. This is a really good way to start a base coat for a lot of different things where you want to get some movement in what's going on underneath it. You don't want it to just be flat color. So things like stone, brick, marble, wood, we're going to use this texture for all those different things. We'll just use it in slightly different ways. So for marble and wood, it's going to be more directional. For stone, it's going to be more random. So I'm just going to start, I've dampened my brushes, and I'm going to use a brush for each color. You can do this with one brush and just keep dipping it into alternate colors, but what I find is that if you do that on too big of a surface, it just gets really muddy really fast. So I'm going to lay down a section of color here, and then color 2 is going to come over here, this, and then I'm going to just start blending those two colors together. Now, technically a scumble is something where I'm going to leave that transition a little more defined, so you can still really kind of see where those two colors are coming together. A wet blend is a little bit smoother. For the stone, I think I'm going to kind of like having something that's got a little more texture, also because these two colors aren't hugely contrasty. I can kind of get away with that. If you've taken fundamentals of tech, this is George and Ben, I think, teach more of a traditional scumble. As you're doing this, what you want to do is you want to make sure that your patches of color are alternating and random in size and shape. So, you might have a little one over here, and you might have a slightly larger one somewhere else. But I'm using this crosshatch stroke, and I'm just letting those two colors, right? So you can see that there are areas where we have a very defined color number 1, we have a very defined color number 2, and then we have areas where those two colors are transitioning into one another. So I'm going to continue on with this, and I will be back when I am done with it. So for the brick area, I'm going to do more of a wet blend. When you do your project, I want you to do a wet blend on one, and I want you to do a scumble on the other one, but I don't really care which is which. You can choose. I'm just arbitrarily doing it this way. So I'm going to, for the wet blend, start very much the same way. Two colors. These are more brick colors. And I might use a little bit more water in my brush on this, just because I want to get a little more of a transition, a little more of a blend here. And so with this one, I'm really going to let the edges of those two colors meld together. And I might even choose to use a third brush that is clean to help me get those two colors moving together. Now these two colors don't have quite as much contrast either, so they're going to be a little easier to get a nice, even, smooth blend going. But you can do this, you can do a wet blend with colors that have more contrast. The only thing is that you need it to be a fairly decent sized area, because the more area you have that you can use to transition, obviously, right, the easier it will be to get those two colors to go into one another. So, you can also do both of these techniques, although I will say the scumble is easier, with a roller or with a couple of rollers. If you look at the floor for working, that was done with the rollers and two colors. So we just put down color with the rollers and then took a third roller that was a neutral roller, did not have any color in it, and used that to blend the colors together. Working it. You do have to, with both these techniques, you have to work quickly. You don't want to let the paint get dry. You don't want to get a dry edge, or you're going to have a really strong line between your colors. So keep it moving. If you have to do this on a really large surface, it can also be helpful if you're trying to get this wet blend where you've got a really nice smooth transition. Can also be helpful to have a sprayer, just like a garden sprayer of water that you can mist over the paint. It will help blend it. It'll also help keep that wet edge so that you're not fighting the paint drying quite so much. And I'm not going to mind the fact that there's brush strokes in this, but I am trying to get a nice, smooth transition between my colors. When you're doing a wet blend, particularly, although it sort of goes for the scumble as well, I always tell people I don't want to see cows and I don't want to see zebras. So there needs to be transition between the colors. It can't just be splotches of colors like a Holstein cow, right? And the zebras come in when it gets into linear scumbles like on wood grains, right? We don't want to see zebras. So I love animals and they're wonderful creatures, but I don't want them in the paint. All right, so there we have a fairly nice wet blend, and hopefully, if you can't tell from here, you'll be able to tell from, I'll do a closer up version of this, but you'll be able to see the difference between these two. The wet blend, again, is just a lot more smoothly blended together. There's less sense of there being two distinctive colors. It's sort of colors that move in and out of one another, whereas the scumble, you can really see the two colors. They're just, the brush strokes are helping to create those transitions. So here we have the finished wet blend and scumble. So here's our scumble, right? And you can really see on this one now how, even though there's distinctive differences in the two colors, and we can see where they're blending together, it has a sense of being blended, right? It's not just splotches. And then over here, so that's our scumble, and then here we have our wet blend. And on the wet blend, it's harder to tell where one color starts and stops and where the other color starts and stops, right? It's more of a transition between the two colors. So that's the difference between the wet blend and the scumble. And then we'll be moving on into some other types of texture. Our first texture that we're going to look at beyond this is a spatter. So the spatter is really probably the simplest texture to create. All we're going to do is just flick paint at the surface, and in theory that should give us something really lovely. Now there are a few ways in which this can go wrong. The first thing about spattering is you need to be very aware of what is around you, okay? Paint is going to go everywhere. Newtonian physics tells us that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, which means that if paint goes that way, there's also paint going to go the other way. So be aware if there are other people's projects or other things that should not get paint on them in your near vicinity. Either move yourself or move the thing, okay? That's the first thing to remember. The next thing to remember is the type of brush that you're going to use. So you can choose a brush to do different things, right? The consistency of the paint, the type of the brush you use, all these things are going to affect how much paint comes out of the bristles and what size droplets are going to come out of the bristles. So bristles that are more flexible and springy and looser are going to probably give you a little bit larger spatter and a little bit more spatter. Something that's a stiffer brush with a tighter, tighter bristles is going to give you a finer spatter. It's going to be more controlled. So it just depends on what you're trying to do. So I'm going to start with the brick here, and I have a dark color. And again, I want to make sure that there's enough contrast that I can see what is going on. So I'm using this brush, and I'm going to test this before I just go flicking it at my flat to see if, for example, the spatter that's coming off of the brush is the way that I want it. And this is a pretty tight spatter, which is okay for this brick. So the droplets that I'm getting are fairly even in size, and they're fairly evenly distributed. They're not spreading out a lot. So I'm just flicking my wrist. And I'm not necessarily trying to do this in, to make a consistent coverage. There might be times where that's useful, but for this, I want my brick to have a little bit of movement and texture in it. So I'm just going to let this go like that. If I wanted this spatter to be softer, I could add more water to my paint. I could spritz it with water. I could also just come back behind it with a brush that's just got water in it, and I could spatter that onto that wet spatter. And you have to do this while your spatter is still wet enough that it's going to actually do something. But that'll start to cause that spatter to kind of bleed out and expand. There are several other things that you can use to create different textures within your spatter, one of which is just plain old soap water. So we've got, I spattered with water, but then you can also spatter with soap water if you have enough paint. The soap actually kind of acts as a resist. Denatured alcohol also does interesting things. So you can play around with different things that you put over the spatter. Also, if the paint underneath, if your base coat is still wet, which mine probably is a little bit damp, it's going to do different things than if it's totally dry. So we always do tests, and I'm going to ask you to make test boards for this project where you can test these different textures and test your spatters and those kinds of things ahead of time so that you have some sense of what you're doing. Now, the other thing to remember about spatter is that you cannot control it completely. Spatter is going to do what spatter wants to do. So you have some control over the size of droplets, over the density of the spatter, but you also have to sort of be okay with letting it do what it wants to do. So there is that part of it. There's another way to spatter, and I'm going to use a lighter color now. I'm not letting this dry just for demonstration purposes. Again, if I let this dry, I'm going to get more contrast between my dark and my light because the dark is going to already be dry. It's not going to bleed into the light. But I'm going to go ahead and do this while it's still wet, just for demonstration. So I can also use my brush, and instead of flicking it, right, I'm actually going to tap it on my hand. This gives you, again, a little bit different control of where the paint is going. The thing that I don't like about this particular method is that this is where Newtonian physics really comes in, right? When you're flicking your wrist, like the percussion isn't there, and so when I do this, there's a lot of paint flying back at me. When I do this, there's less paint flying back at me. Play around with both of them, see what works for you. But you will very rarely see me doing the whack it against my hand. You can also whack it against another brush if it starts to get painful. If you have to do this for a long period of time, whacking it against your hand gets kind of painful. So anyway, so there is one way of doing some texture, getting some texture onto a surface. And so that is spattering. And then we're going to move on into a couple of other things, rag rolling and sponging. So you may have noticed when I was doing the spatter that I had my project on the floor, and that's because you really want that distance. If you try to spatter with your flat up on sawhorses like this, there's just not enough room for that spatter to disperse, and you end up with something that's very linear and very distinctive, has a very distinctive pattern to it. So that's the reason for putting it on the floor. You really want to get some distance, but I don't want to crawl around on the floor, so it's back up on the sawhorses for sponging. All right. So natural sponges are what we're going to use. You can see there are various textures. There's textures within the same sponge, right? This one has a very fine texture here, a more coarse texture here. This one is kind of the same all around, but depending on which side you use, you might get some slightly different patterns and textures with it. So I've got one of the base colors from this, and I've got one other color. It kind of depends just on what you're trying to accomplish. I'm going to start with this one. And this probably is a little more contrast than what you would actually want for something like this, but I want you to be able to see it. So, so when I'm doing sponging, I can do something that's very just sort of textural and random. And you'll notice I am really continually moving my sponge around and kind of dancing it across the surface. And what that avoids doing is what I call the potato print style of painting, which, you know, remember the potato stamps you made when you were a kid? Right? We want to avoid having the same pattern. If you do this without moving it, you end up with something that looks very defined and linear. So we want to keep that moving. And here again, I might want to, if I'm just doing this with one color, I might actually I've just turned it over and I'm using the side of the sponge that doesn't have any paint in it to kind of blend out the edges and make it a little less, again, a little less defined. It's a pretty stark pattern there. But I can also use this other color, and I'm just kind of getting some paint in the sponge, but then I'm letting it come back out again. So I can use this then to kind of break that back up again and blend it back in. With sponging, same as with the scumble or the wet blend, you know, you can use more than two colors. You just want to make sure that you're not using so many colors that you can't keep track of it or it gets muddy. So 2 or 3 probably is good. But you can use the colors to, you know, you can blend it together. You can also, if you saturate your sponge a little bit more, you can basically do a wet blend. And that gives you, again, just a different kind of texture. And I might choose to do both of these things on the same surface, right? There's nothing that says that, you know, you start one way and you have to do the same thing all the way through. Texture is all about creating variation. So we want to make sure that whatever we're doing, right, is giving us that sense of variation. We could keep working with that. I'm also letting some of my underneath colors still come through because I've done this nice scumble. I don't want to totally obliterate it. So I might do more or less in some places. So that's the basics of sponging. And then for rag rolling, we're going to take a rag and we're going to dip it in some paint, get it good and saturated. These rags, I just pulled this out of the rag box. It's a synthetic fabric, so it's going to hold paint a little differently than something that was a natural fabric, like something that was cotton. But as long as it will hold paint, you'll be fine, right? As long as it's somewhat absorbent. So I'm going to take this now, and I'm going to kind of scrunch it up and make kind of a loosely twisted sausage shape out of it. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm literally going to roll it across my surface. And all of those little crinkles and creases are going to create texture. Now, I'm doing this on, this, I don't know that I would do, obviously I wouldn't do that over there and this over here if this was my finished project. But I could rag roll and then sponge over the top if I wanted to, or I could, more often I do, if I'm going to do a multiple textures, it will be, a rag roll and a spatter, or a sponging and a spatter, because the spatter just gives it another layer of texture. So, and I can again do this with multiple colors. I can use this, and if I do this and then let it dry and then come and roll back over it with, let's say, a lighter color, it's going to look more like a stucco kind of texture, or something that's got a lot of little nooks and crannies and high points and low points. If I come back in with my lighter color now while it's still wet, I'm going to get a very different look to it. But that's the basics of rag rolling, and now my hands are covered in paint and I have to turn my camera off. Oh well, that's the basics of texture for this time. And that will be what we will be doing on the next project.